Have the Bidens done much different to other US presidents, do you think?
They haven't, really. They're actually kind of traditional. They are corrupt in almost a more old-fashioned way than the Clintons or the Trumps were.
Welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast, answering the difficult questions, Robert Morris, and asking the stupid questions, Rory McElhone.
Hello, Rory. How's it going?
It's going well. How are you, Rob?
It's an exciting morning here in the United States. We've just learned last night that the Democrats will have a majority in the Senate. It's amazing how exciting it now seems after 2 years of having just 50 seats in the Senate and Vice President Kamala Harris making the tie-breaking vote. Now the Democrats are going to have 51 votes. The most exciting thing about this meeting that, we haven't heard the last of Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, but with that one more vote that was picked up in the Georgia runoff last night, Raphael Warnock, we're going to hear less about Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, which is very exciting as a U.S. news consumer.
It is very exciting. Do you think he was fond of a bit of corruption?
I'm not entirely certain. I've heard some disturbing things about Warnock recently, but the thing about Warnock was that he was so much, even with some of the disturbing things I've heard, he was just so much better than Herschel Walker, who was kind of a nightmare of a human being. He was sort of like a pro football player who's running on family values with multiple families, multiple children, multiple abortions. It was just really kind of a mess.
Multiple values.
But one of the great things about this, Rory, is that we're not going to get, for sure now, with the Democrats strongly in control of the Senate, we're not going to get an impeachment trial. Joe Biden is going to be able to continue to govern for his next 2 years. Joe Biden is not going to be able to get any kind of, it seems very unlikely that Joe Biden is going to be able to get any, I don't want to be too conclusive about this, it seems very unlikely that he's going to be able to get any kind of real legislative accomplishments because the Democrats did lose the lower house. They lost the lower house, but the Republicans have the majority down there. But no matter how many times the House of Representatives, the Republican House of Representatives vote to, I'm not saying this is necessarily going to happen, but it could definitely happen. They could vote to impeach Joe Biden. We're never going to get an impeachment trial up in the Senate because the Democrats have control of it and simply won't let that happen. And that's a very good thing. It means that U.S. politics will spend another 2 years of being less of a sideshow than they were during the Trump administration. Don't get me wrong, they will still be a sideshow, but they will be not quite as damaging and completely antagonistic to any kind of decent government as they were during the Trump administration, or as I feared they might be if the Republicans won both houses of Congress. So that's very exciting stuff. But what I want to talk about today is what those Republicans in the lower house and the House of Representatives are going to be doing. And what they're definitely going to be doing is investigating the Biden family.
Have the Bidens done much different to other U.S. presidents, do you think?
They haven't, really. And that's sort of the crux of
keeping up traditions.
Well, it's certainly they're actually kind of traditional. They are corrupt in almost a more old-fashioned way than the Clintons or the Trumps were.
Well, I think the Trumps came across very obviously corrupt. You kind of just went, oh, they're corrupt in almost in a brazen way, while the rest come across as, they're a lot sneakier and know what they're doing.
Well, I think the Clintons were sneakier and knew what they were doing. The Bushes knew what they were doing on a epic scale. I think I read some estimate of George W. Bush's net worth recently. I feel like it was somewhere in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's just George W. That doesn't count Jeb or the other siblings, the other children of the initial president. And I think so they became this fabulously wealthy off of maybe 20 years of George Bush Sr. being a Texas oil man in the 40s or the 50s or 60s. George W. Bush, I think the only job he had other than being a politician was owning a baseball team or something. That's not something you don't own.
That's a weird first job.
I mean, he had other jobs, but you don't.
Is he George Costanza?
That was his most significant job, anyway. I don't want to get too far down the Bush rabbit hole. I want to get there in a bit, but I think that a lot of sort of the liberal media knee-jerk reaction now that it seems clear that what we're going to be talking about in the House of Representatives for the next 2 years is Hunter Biden, the Biden family more generally. I think the sort of knee-jerk reaction...
Well, what was he doing in Ukraine?
Well, yes, what was he doing in Ukraine? And the thing is, I think that the standard approach to this from like the New York Times, CNN, MSNBC is to be like, this isn't interesting. This is stupid. Everybody knows this is what happens. This is just what politicians do. And what I would argue, Rory, is like, no, like Congress isn't going to be doing anything else for the next 2 years. I think it would actually be good or even pretty great if Congress spent some time humiliating some corrupt politicians, because you can certainly see ways that this can be steered towards just being an unfair hatchet job against the Biden family. Which certainly has many things that are, if not illegal, are certainly deeply unethical. But if the Democrats actually take this opportunity, and I'm not too familiar with the minutia of scheduling hearings and what kind of what the administrative procedures are for setting up whatever the media spectacle is we're going to get. But I've got to believe that if the Democrats agree to go in with the Republicans on this and say, okay, let's do Hunter Biden if we can do the Trumps. Like, why don't we just do a fairly searching and honest inventory of the corruption of the last two presidents or the ones beyond it? And, I would argue, you can argue that this would be disruptive to the Biden presidency, but it's going to happen anyway.
Well, you would hope there would be some sort of cleansing some stage. And he already did Afghanistan, which no one thought would happen. So why not get it all out?
Yeah. Why not? I mean, it's and the thing about this is, unless there is some smoking gun down in the depths there, which there might be, and if there is, we should see it. The investigation of Hunter Biden isn't really going to make Joe Biden look that bad.
Well, it tends to give him some sympathy quite often, because it's seen as, his son that was, destined to be sort of his clone tragically died, and the son that's not the best, shall we say, and has his own problems, is now causing him trouble.
He's a debauched drug addict. I mean, he's a mess. I have sympathy for that, as somebody who's had some substance abuse issues myself. But at some point when a man is in his 50s.
Yeah, when we talk about a son, I imagine a younger man. But when you say a man in his 50s, yeah, he's not in his 20s running about in daddy's money.
Yeah, he is in his 50s, and he has spent his entire life running around on daddy's money. Yeah, so looking at this right now, he's 52 years old. And I think it actually is worth, as embarrassing and as hard as it might be for the Biden family. I mean, that's tough. And I am certainly more sympathetic to the Biden family than the Trumps, but they made the choice to be president. And I think it's undeniable that we have a tremendous issue with presidential corruption in the United States.
How far back do you think this goes? Because I know the likes of Kennedy was horrifically corrupt. And I'm sure if you go very back to the very early ones, quite often when they owned slaves, you sort of think, maybe not the best.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, so politics is corrupt. That's a fact. That's the way the world works. That's life. But if you take that attitude towards individual aspects of corruption, saying, oh, you toss up your hands and you're like, oh, well, nothing to be done. then it gets worse and it gets worse and it gets worse and it's worse. Yes, politics.
It festers.
Yes, it festers. Politics is always going to be corrupt, but that also means that in each new generation, we have to fight against that corruption, because if we don't fight against that corruption, it's going to be system ending. I mean, there are some contexts in which I think the United States could use perhaps a more relaxed attitude towards certain kinds of corruption, certain types of political skullduggery. I do not think that's the case at the presidential level, because while every U.S. president has been corrupt to some degree in certain ways, the institution of the U.S. president has become extraordinarily powerful.
Absolutely.
Just the office and what you can do with it is has far exceeded the bounds of what folks would consider the U.S. Constitution, as recently as the 1990s. And in the 1990s, the office of the president was vastly more powerful than anybody would expect it to have been from the context of the 1920s. So it's, as the president gets more and more powerful, it becomes more and more important that we make the selection process to become the president more and more bruising, frankly. We want it to be difficult. We want the standard to be incredibly high. And with the Clintons, the Trumps, and now the Bidens, the standard's been pretty low. And I think much more in the Trump administration than in the Biden administration, we saw a lot of those sort of next order corruption issues where it's like, okay, this is going from, well, politics is always corrupt.
Well, didn't Kushner get $1 billion?
Kushner has gotten $3 billion.
That is just an insane amount of money. It is.
He has gotten $3 billion in more or less. I would allege, I'm not sure. It's funny. I think talking about this, I wonder, is this something you could get sued for? But then I think that Kushner desperately doesn't want people talking about this at all, and actually suing somebody about it would create a Streisand effect, a bigger thing. But yeah, I think it is fair to allege, at least, that Jared Kushner.
It is heavily alleged.
Yes, Jared Kushner has gotten about $3 billion in direct payments for his work as Donald Trump's Middle East envoy.
Just to put that into context, Northern Ireland costs the UK roughly $10 billion a year. So that could keep Northern Ireland going for a few months.
Wow. So Jared Kushner, for his work in the Middle East, been paid by Saudi Arabia and Qatar a third of the annual operating costs of Northern Ireland.
And that's considered high because we have high security costs. Do you know what I mean? So we're strange. But yeah, that's just to keep it ticking over for a year.
That is extraordinary. So to be clear, the payments that Jared Kushner got, I believe, they are of two different natures. Now, the $2 billion he got from Saudi Arabia, I would argue, are like a straightforward payment. But with the state of the law in the United States right now, the state of business ethics, political ethics in the United States right now, it's certainly insane in terms of the scale of payment that Jared Kushner has gotten. But sadly, not just for presidential staffers, congressional staffers, congresspeople, generals, even for much lower level bureaucrats, it is not strange or illegal at all in the U.S. government today for somebody to go move from government to collecting a paycheck from somebody who they were overseeing in government. Sadly, that's tragically, horrifically, that's just normal.
Because when I'm imagining corruption at this level, I thought there would be a lot of more insider trading stuff that's harder to trace rather than just someone getting a heap of cash in their bank account.
There usually is. And that's a good instinct, Rory, because there usually is. It is very strange and incredibly brazen and out there So what happened is Jared Kushner is like, oh, my next job, as I leave the White House is I am going to set up, I'm not sure exactly what it was. It was a private equity fund or a hedge fund or something like that. And the Saudi Arabian government is going to give me $2 billion. It's an investment in this business opportunity I am providing to the Saudi Arabian government. So it wasn't.
Yes, because I'm sure Saudi could not ever do that themselves.
Yeah. As if the Saudis don't have the most competent, most stunningly successful business managers in the world, falling over themselves to invest Saudi money. No, Jared Kushner, a failed newspaper owner, a failed real estate guy from New York, who just happens to have been the Middle East envoy, has gotten a $2 billion check. So I think that the scale of that, the sheer horrific brazenness of that, is obviously corrupt by any sane moral system, but I don't think it's actually illegal. is the horrific thing.
Well, it was reported on the news, and it was just sort of like, yep, that's a thing.
And the problem here, and I think this is the real problem. This is why the sort of elite Democratic, liberal, whatever. I mean, we've talked about what I feel about media bias, but in this respect, I do think it is a sort of friendly to our pals who tend to be Democrats. Well, also, but it ends up being friendly to Jared Kushner as well, because Kushner gets the same treatment that the Clintons do. And it's just this idea, well, it's only natural for the Clintons to want to benefit when they're out of office. So any scrutiny of that, of the Clinton foundations, of Teneo Consulting, of the various Clinton businesses. And of course, the Clintons, who I think Hillary Clinton files a tax form, so I think her net worth is public record. And I think that's also to the tune of tens or low hundreds of millions of dollars. That's through exactly what you were talking about, Rory, like the more carefully shielded, inside, got I just, bought this right thing at the right time. Actually, probably not even inside trading for the Clintons. They just got in on the right private equity deals, which aren't subject to those same strictures around public market inside trading or whatnot. Sorry, I'm getting a little too into securities regulation stuff there, but exactly what you were saying is exactly true. There are subtler and more savvy ways to profit off of your time in government that the Clintons have.
Well, I'm thinking with the Bushes were able to then, push through a hell of a lot of oil regulations, or not the opposite, sorry, deregulated and help. They were fully aware of the market and were able to then maximize it for themselves and their friends.
Well, the Bush family is interesting because there are elements of it that are very like the Biden family. So the Hunter Biden scandal is certainly going to be the main focus. It's salacious. There's apparently sex tapes, this, that, and the other thing. He's really just a famous mess. But what I think is more interesting and probably should be more damaging to Joe Biden are Joe Biden's brothers. So Joe Biden, let's see here, I'm just Googling this again. Joe Biden's brothers, he's got at least two. Yeah, Francis W. Biden and James Bryan Biden. I am not too familiar on the details with these guys, but I do know that at least one of them has been, for his entire career, a wheeler dealer based on access to Joe Biden. Well, it's not going to implicate the Obama administration. It's actually very interesting. I read through Hunter Biden's own biography. So Hunter Biden, in his 30s, late 20s and 30s, was a full-time lobbyist in Washington, D.C. in the 1990s and through to, I think, 2006, 2007 or something like that. Was a full-time lobbyist in Washington, D.C., but then he acknowledged that, oh, wait, actually, now that, my dad is going to be the vice president, there's too much. Even the Biden family was too smart for that. They were like, well, I can't actually be lobbying the government when my dad is the vice president. I'm going to stop being a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. And I think that Biden's brothers, the corruption there goes back to, Biden is he's 80 years old. I think he's got one older brother, or I'm not sure if he's the oldest. So these are guys who were essentially most of the way towards retired by the time Joe Biden was even vice president. But their careers were made in the same sorts of just sort of political wheeler dealing type stuff that we see in the Bush family, that we see going back for presidents throughout the history of the republic. But what sort of happens is that the scale has gone up much, much higher. And we see that with the Clintons, who have become centimillionaires off of being president. I don't really begrudge. I think it's going to be pretty obvious in this talk that I'm not really talking about the Obamas. Because Obama is, I think, there are a lot of people who are very angry about what Obama's been up to after his time in office. And I think there are a lot of people who would say that Obama acted in a lot of ways in service to the U.S. business community, U.S. banks, and has been profiting off of that after the fact. I think a lot of folks can make that argument. But also, Obama doesn't have this, he does have brothers and sisters, but he doesn't have this cast of nefarious hangers-on. You know, Hillary Clinton had brothers who were profiteers.
Would I be right in saying that he would be, his family were probably one of the least wealthy of recent presidents?
Obama and Bill Clinton are probably Obama, I feel like I think Obama was comfortably middle class. My understanding is that Bill Clinton grew up poor. I think Obama was raised, had sort of like a hippie mom and like spent a lot of time being raised by his grandparents, which is difficult. But I don't think that they were ever in particularly straitened circumstances. I think he spent a lot of time growing up.
But the other ones seem to sort of be at ludicrous wealth even before they become president.
That's more of a recent development, and I think that's sort of what I was getting at is that just these. So certainly, Bill Clinton in 1992 could have offered himself off as a more or less a poor boy done good. Hillary Clinton was offering herself up in 2016 as like the absolute height of eliteness, patricianness, connectedness, and already as a centimillionaire.
Was she born fairly well-to-do?
I don't know the details of the Rodhams. I'm sorry.
By that age, she definitely had been doing very well for a long time.
Yeah, I'm going to assume that if Hillary Rodham was famously a supporter of Barry Goldwater in 1964, who was the sort of birth of the conservative movement that we know today. So I'm going to assume she came from some money, but I don't know that to be the case. I don't know this sure. But the thing about Obama is he does not, and this is actually something a lot of Democrats are very angry about. In a political sense, the way that there were just massacres of the Democrats in every midterm election that Obama was president for, is he just didn't have a lot of loyalty to the Democratic Party. He really did rise not through wheeler dealing, not through Biden's like decades of
grind
being bought in the Senate. I mean, he was just really compelling, great speaker, great bio.
Oh, he's a great orator.
Exactly. So he didn't really owe people much coming in as president. And there's a sort of cynical interpretation that he wanted to be rich and famous, and being president allowed him to be rich and famous. And he got out of, I mean, this is similar to the Kushner got a big check from Saudi Arabia, and Obama has a pile of checks from Netflix, a number of other places, whoever's paying him to do that. So so I certainly begrudge Obama the scale of the wealth that he's accumulating. But it's very similar to, I think Gerald Ford was the first guy who pretty famously, Ford was a career politician from an earlier era. Gerald Ford, who was president, I guess he's our only unelected president. There must be another one. Or our only never elected president. He was Nixon's.
Was Lyndon B. Johnson not?
Oh, he was landslide elected in 1964 after Kennedy's assassination.
When he first came in, he wasn't elected, isn't that right?
Yes, he came in when Kennedy was assassinated, but then in 1964 he ran himself and won a massive landslide election.
Into 1969, wasn't it?
I think 68 he decided decided not to run because, I mean, it's the whole Johnson story is just this tremendous fall from grace.
Well, he's known as working himself to death, isn't it?
Well, no, so Johnson came in because Kennedy was assassinated, which probably would have worked probably good for him because he wasn't necessarily too good on the campaign trail, but he was famously like one of the most successful presidents in history in terms of getting a legislative agenda through, because he was a guy who one of the volumes of his biography is called The Master of the Senate, and that's before he became vice president and then president. So he had this incredibly successful legislative agenda.
He was just an incredibly hardworking man.
He was. Interpretations on that can vary, but he was an operator.
I think compared to his contemporaries.
That's true. I think he was an operator. He was a guy who he knew what he wanted to get and he got it. But the problem for Johnson was that in addition to this extraordinary, he put in place a lot of the Social Security as a New Deal program under FDR, but healthcare protections, old folks healthcare, a lot of what we really rely on in this country today, Johnson put in place, won a landslide victory on that in 1964, and then got us into Vietnam. And Vietnam was such a disaster by, we had already been in Vietnam, but he made the decision, around Gulf of Tonkin to dive in deeper and deeper and deeper. And by 1968, it was so toxic that he actually decided not to run. But anyway, Ford, who became president in, I'm not sure if it was 1973 or 1974 when Nixon resigned.
Yeah, 74.
Then was president for a year or two and ran in 1976 and was defeated by Carter. So Ford, before he became Nixon's vice president, was just a congressperson in an era when I'm sure there are aspects of what he did that were corrupt or what have you, but there were not the insane paydays that there are today for political corruption.
You were more of a jobbing civil servant, that sort of thing?
I think that's true. I think there's some truth to that. So Ford got a lot of criticism because I think Ford and Obama's post-presidencies are very similar.
Okay.
So what Ford did was he just, for the next 10, 15 years, he just traveled the country speaking to any group of bankers who would, put together X $1,000 to hear him speak. He was the first president who really famously made a ton of money off of speaking fees. And he's the guy who, because he wanted to guarantee his retirement. And that's how he became sort of reasonably wealthy. So the parallel between Obama and Gerald Ford that I think is interesting is that it illustrates how much more outsized the rewards for corruption are now and why it's so much more important that we should be looking harder at corruption. So I think that the post-presidencies of Gerald Ford and Barack Obama are actually kind of similar. Gerald Ford in a way that, is a little grim looking, but not illegal or even necessarily particularly unethical, just sort of went around and cashed checks to speak at corporate retreats. And he did that for years. Similar to Tony Blair? Yeah, I think, but Tony Blair is being paid a lot more than Gerald Ford was.
Yeah.
But
that was part of the Iraq War gig, apparently.
Yeah. Because Obama is in this sort of different era. He's getting, these insane movie deals with Netflix. He's got a deal with Spotify. There's a number of other things. So it's just an indication. I think that what Obama is doing is very similar to what Gerald Ford is doing. It's just, making himself
the modern version
as, run of the mill wealthy as, not a Bush, but, as a Clinton, through, monetizing his celebrity as an ex-president.
But are these less sleazy? Because, a Netflix show is basically, we like you, can we film you?
Yeah.
It isn't sort of, I'm going to help deregulate this wildland so you can do all you want. It's sort of more transparent.
Exactly. I think it's very transparent. I think it is a monetizing of celebrity. And that's why I think that Obama and Ford are, kind of the same thing. But Obama is just on this ginormous scale.
Obama can tie his laces and chew bubblegum.
Yes, that too. It's funny. So Gerald Ford famously God, I guess Chevy Chase is probably a name that's being forgotten, but Chevy Chase became famous as a comedian. He was the old guy on Community. So he became famous by making fun of Gerald Ford as a big klutz. And it was interesting. I think I saw this on Twitter recently. Someone had pointed out, it's like, actually, Gerald Ford was like an all-American football player, for the University of Michigan. So he was actually a fairly serious elite level athlete. He may have been one of the most fit, coordinated presidents we've ever had. But, you just I think at some point he might have fallen down in the White House, and that became a gag that Saturday Night Live ran with.
It's also just his look. He does have a Homer Simpson-esque face.
He does have a sort of classical, he just looks like a 20th century white man, doesn't he? I have a soft spot for Gerald Ford. He's a graduate of the University of Michigan, as I am myself, and I did a lot of research for my undergraduate thesis in the Gerald Ford Presidential Library, which is, in keeping with Gerald Ford's whole vibe, it's incredibly modest. It's it looks like a sort of 1970s middle school up on the North Campus of the University of Michigan, and they've got boxes of his stuff and boxes of other historically relevant materials, and that's pretty much the Gerald Ford Presidential Library, as distinct from. And this is another, actually, I haven't heard a bunch about the Trump Presidential Library. I'm surprised that isn't.
Is it usually something they do in their lifetime, or is it something their estate would do?
It's something they do in their lifetime. I think that Obama has some incredibly glitzy complex being built in Chicago.
But that would be a really cool library, let's be honest.
Of course it'd be.
You want to be in the Obama library.
Of course you want to go to an Obama library, but the Reagan library, I'm sure there's a big Bush library in Texas somewhere for each of the Bushes. The Clinton Library. These are just famously glitzy, Starkitect built boondoggles now. Gerald Ford's Presidential Library is nice and humble and workmanlike, like Gerald Ford himself. I don't want to ignore Obama and the tastelessness of his. One of the greatest things I saw on Twitter was someone was like, "Did Barack Obama get elected president so he could do a podcast with Bruce Springsteen?" Which I thought that was somebody else said that on Twitter. I can't recall who.
Well, I think as all the motivations go, I think that's probably one of the better ones.
True enough.
The people that want to make certain countries turn into glass is
true enough.
Sadly, probably more true than wanting a podcast with musicians.
Yeah, so what Obama's up to is definitely tawdry, but it's just not on the scale of like the old time machine corruption of the Biden family, the just truly epic grifting of the Clintons, and the occasionally monstrous actions of the Bush family. The Bush family, because it's multi-generational, the Clintons are, nouveau riche on the make.
But also they didn't get into the second gear with Hillary. She never became president to really bring it to the next level.
Exactly. I think that's a very good point. So not only was George W. Bush president for 8 years, which allowed this very already incredibly well-established.
Did the Green Party have something to do with it? I heard that if the Green Party weren't there, those votes probably would have went to the Democrats.
Oh, no question.
Because you remember it was incredibly tight, and theoretically he did lose. It's just something I find fascinating that it's like the Green Party getting a handful of votes was enough to stop Al Gore.
I remember 2000 very well.
I just think what a very different world we would live in.
Very different. Very different. I think 2000 was the first presidential election that I voted in.
I haven't voted in any presidential elections.
And actually, I voted Green. I voted for Ralph Nader.
Oh, it's all your fault.
It is. I screwed it up. Well, I voted in Michigan, which I think was very strongly for Al Gore. Had I been in Florida, you'd be right to accuse me. But yeah, Ralph Nader, who's probably the most high profile and attractive Green Party candidate we've ever had. Ralph Nader was actually nationwide famous from the 1960s as a consumer advocate. And he ran in 2000. I think he got somewhere along the lines of 1% of the vote. Maybe it was a little higher.
Is it 4% you have to get in order to then sort of be treated like a party and you get a lot more benefits?
I don't know the details of that, but that's more for like funding and access and ballot access. That doesn't, if you get the votes, it's in the election yourself. It's a vote that you get and Al Gore doesn't get. And I think it's pretty clear that even if there had been a less, if Jill Stein had been the Green Party candidate or whoever in 2000 instead of Ralph Nader, this universally respected figure, then yeah, Al Gore would have been president. The Iraq War might have happened, but it would have been damn sight better executed. That's for sure.
Or it could have been the Saudi Arabia war.
Well, I find that that does sound nice, but I don't think that the Al Gore would have been quite as craven in covering up for the Saudis as George W. Bush was. But also, it's an open question: is like, would Al Gore and his team that would have largely have been there without disruption throughout the 90s, would they have been as neglectful as to allow 9/11 to happen? That's a more interesting question to me.
Well, yeah, it seemed to be a lot. Obviously, it's a horrific domino effect, but small bits of legislation could have prevented it.
Going back to Bruce Riedel's Kings and Presidents, Bruce Riedel is a really well-connected, I talked about him in a video in the past couple of weeks, really well-connected guy who knew all the Saudi people and turned against the Saudis, I think over Yemen, really, wrote this book about what the politics were like in 2001 between the Saudi government and the Bush administration. And it was fascinating because the Saudi government was outraged at the Bush administration over the Bush administration's treatment of the Palestinians throughout 2001. This is something else that's really neglected. The Clinton, Gore would have been a successor to Clinton, would have been very interested in trying to make the Oslo Accords work, would have been unlikely to be as dismissive of Palestinian rights as the Bush administration was. Now, I don't think, I can't say, I certainly doubt that Crown Prince Abdullah, the guy who was in charge at that point, was like, fuck it, let's do a 9/11. But he was certainly, sort of Henry II style with Thomas Becket or what have you. But, like, who will rid me of these damn Americans? And perhaps the level of anger that the Bush administration had prompted in the Saudi royal family convinced some Saudi government folks on the margins, or Saudi royal family folks on the margins, to go ahead and allow this 9/11 thing to happen, or simply not tell these crappy Bush people that they didn't like, these crappy new Bush people that they didn't like about it, So like, yeah, there's a million what haves or where have yous, but I'd like to actually get back to the Bushes because I think this is kind of interesting. Because it's generational corruption. And I think that by the George W. Bush administration, they were so well established and already so wealthy that there's not a lot of really, that bad stuff. Jeb and George W. have a brother named Neil, who was not political because he just went.
So the only smart one?
He's not particularly smart, actually. He, in the 80s, we had before the crypto crash, before the housing crash, before the tech crash. In the 80s, we had something called the savings and loans crash. It was basically Reagan administration. We used to have this thing called savings and loans. This also actually ties into the current housing crisis in the United States, but that's a little too digressiveness. That used to, with very little profit involved, provide money for people to buy housing. These were the savings and loans. The Reagan administration came in and said, you know what? These savings and loans have too many restrictions on them. Let's let them, be financially innovative. And before Reagan even left office, these staid, boring institutions that had helped people buy houses for 50 years, I'm pretty sure they were a New Deal type deal, or maybe even longer than that, all blew up. because they got into all kinds of stuff they shouldn't have been. And Neil Bush, George and Jeb's brother, first became famous as being, I think, on the board or part of the leadership of one of these failing savings and loans that the U.S. government, in fact, his father, H.W. Bush.
So were they essentially taking this money for, savings and loans and gambling it essentially?
Yeah. Well, no, Rory. They weren't gambling it. They were investing in the future.
Wisely investing it.
Yes, financial innovation with such extraordinary success that it managed to blow up entirely nationwide. And back when billions were real amounts of money. I think it was tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars that the U.S. government had to foot to pay off. But it's not like Neil Bush in particular was responsible for that. But I think his relation to that meant he could.
But they served a jail time, didn't they?
Some did. I don't think Neil Bush did. I think he was probably he was tangential. But I mean, so the savings and loans, there were dozens or perhaps even hundreds of these across the country, and each situation was different. So I think Neil Bush couldn't go into politics, so he spent the rest of his life just sort of coasting around the world. And at that point, he probably didn't have to even do anything that was as shady as perhaps Hunter Biden might have done, because his family was already just so absurdly wealthy. He could just sort of coast around and I'm going to have an education business and I'm going to have a da-da-da. But if you go and look at H.W. Bush's brothers, stuff gets pretty dark. The guy named Bucky Bush. So these are, the greatest generation brothers. And I think he's got 2 or 3 brothers, and all of them were deeply involved in not necessarily all of them, but at least 1 or 2 of them were deeply involved in some really, really grim stuff. It was Bucky Bush was still actually profiting. I'm going to correct myself. Even into his nephew's war in Iraq, he was profiteering off of defense contracting. To the tune of millions of dollars. But at that point he was an old man. Jonathan Bush was a big figure in Riggs Bank, which is a really interesting scandal. If you want to spend hours on Wikipedia, it's just one of those really gross sidelines of Cold War CIA skullduggery. Riggs Bank there's a Riggs Bank building literally across the street from the Department of the Treasury, right down the street from the White House in Washington, D.C. And for decades, it was at the center of American power and international financial, I think money laundering, definitely money laundering. That was actually proved by prosecution. So it was the banker for Pinochet in, the murderous dictator of Chile. A lot of Saudi money spun through there.
So all lovely folks.
Yes. And Jonathan Bush, the brother of President H.W. Bush, was a big player at Riggs Bank. And had, I think he had a consulting firm that was purchased into Riggs Bank in the 90s or something like that. I think after his brother had left office, but still, I mean, it's the fact that Riggs Bank was like, oh, this is the kind of business I want to purchase. I should tell you, it was a pretty shady type deal.
I'm just thinking of the webs upon webs of, why you'd do that and the favors you're going to get for such a thing and what it leads to. It is really bizarre when these people are moneyed.
Yeah.
There's sort of, is it for the power or do they just want more and more money?
I think that a lot of them think they're doing the right thing, for sure. I think that the Bush family would think to itself, the guys who were actually presidents were like, oh, well, I'm just helping my family members out. That's okay. But I think in the earlier generation, it's like sort of an old sort of waspy sense of entitlement. And if you look into the folks who founded the CIA, were the biggest Cold Warriors in the parts of the Cold War that actually mattered in the 1940s, 1950s, were all a bunch of like Harvard, Yale guys, a lot like George H.W. Bush. And they saw it as a natural extension of public service.
Boys Club?
Yeah, well, of public service to become wealthy and to use that wealth to shape the world in ways that were outside of strictly public service. So yeah, I mean, it's a lot of stuff that in retrospect is pretty gosh darn grim, and I think should have a light shined on it. But I can certainly see the self-justifications of a lot of these folks. The Clintons became extraordinarily wealthy, doing in part kind of good things. The Clinton Foundation, I think it was interesting. It was probably certainly much more George W. Bush's. One of the only good things he did was helping out a great deal with AIDS in Africa. But the Clinton Foundation had a lot to do with that as well. So the Clinton Foundations did very good work. But of course, the flip side of that is that they were able to do that good work, and they were able to make people very wealthy by collecting in these annual events all the richest and most powerful people in the world. And through a variety of mechanisms, the Clintons could get a slice of the deals that were done at those meetings. So yeah, it's just, money becomes
a finder's fee.
Exactly. So the money becomes self-justifying. You see, oh, well, look at all these people in Africa I'm helping. So it's only natural that I'm taking a private jet, with Jeffrey Epstein off to see the Sultan of Brunei. It's or what have you. And that's a joke mostly, but kind of a joke mostly. It's not surprising to me that these folks find ways to justify this to themselves. But it's pretty grim. And the one last point on the Bush family. So what's interesting about this is H.W. Bush is maybe he's what Beau Biden could have been. Actually, yes. Actually, that's a great parallel. George H.W. Bush is what Beau Biden, the more heroic Biden's son who went to fight in Iraq and I think probably got brain cancer off of that and died. Because George H.W. Bush was a war hero. And he was also the son of a very well-connected senator, Prescott Bush. So yeah, it is interesting the way these political dynasties function. And I think that if we allow the Bidens to just sort of skate on the idea, well, politics are corrupt, everybody's always corrupt. I think we risk creating these generational monsters of corruption like the Bush family.
What ways could this be tackled exactly? I know that, there probably will be an investigation into Hunter, but what way would it manifest to tackle this issue?
I think shining a light on it is important. I think
transparency,
the most important thing, and I think this is something that maybe the Squad, I don't know, the whatever the Yahoo caucus on the Republican side on the House of Representatives could do, is I think this is something that House of Representatives congressional legislators can make a decision like, why don't we investigate the Trumps and the Bidens? Because this like, oh, let's give a blind spot to corruption is the reason that Donald Trump never got. This whole nonsense of the Russia hoax, this whole like, oh, we're going to spend years and years and years failing to find a direct connection between Trump and Russian spies.
One funny thing about Russia is Trump was the first. I know a lot of stuff happens when you're president that isn't really your idea, but he was the first to give Ukraine lethal weapons. He was the one to give javelins and the like. Obama was only giving them, non-lethal aid. So I always think it's funny when they go, oh, he's the one that's good friends with the Russians, when part of why Ukraine is doing so well is because of Trump.
Exactly. And I think that, so this fantasy of like Russia teaming up, the reason that Washington, D.C. was so eager to go in on this, Russia corruption, that sort of thing, this, that, and the other thing, is because most of Washington, D.C. had so little connection to Russia. Because a lot of the more savvy operators in Washington, D.C. kind of could see, by year 2 of Putin, 2002 or so, those savvier operators could say, oh, wait a second, this is looking too shady even for me. There's that. And also just the fact that Russia doesn't have much money compared to the other actors we're talking about here, Gulf monarchs, European countries. I mean, Scandinavia, Sweden, certainly Norway. Norway specifically has infinitely more money to play with in corrupt Washington, D.C. than Russia does. Frickin' Norway. There was this amazing news article maybe a month or so back being like, oh my gosh, Russia poured $300 million into corrupting elections. I'm like, $300 million? And then you read the article and it's like, over 8 years in 24 countries. And I'm like, so over 8 years in 24 countries, Russia managed a tenth of the amount of money that Gulf monarchies have given to Jared Kushner personally? So you understand the reason we were talking about Russia is exactly that instinct of like, oh, politics is corrupt. Let's just let it keep doing it. The reason we were focusing on Russia where there was nothing instead of the Gulf relations where there was infinite stuff, the New York real estate corruption stuff where there was infinite stuff, his media connections where there was infinite stuff, is because the Democrats and everybody else, the establishment Republicans, were just as complicit in all of those issues. So we had to have this Russia nonsense.
So it's just someone they were corrupt with that everyone else wasn't?
Exactly. And Paul Manafort got because he was a moron. He was the guy who decided, well, for 15 years when every other gross lobbyist in Washington, D.C. was like, yeah, I'm going to just steer a little clear of this Russia stuff. Manafort was like, whoo-hoo, opportunities for me. And he probably would have gotten away with it if he hadn't been dumb enough to become Trump's campaign manager. So like the fact that Donald Trump was able to come to power in the first place or stay in power with the blindingly obvious corruption that he was doing, let alone Kushner. I mean, he built a hotel in Washington, D.C. expressly to take bribes, and that hotel closed within a year of him leaving. It's extraordinary. I mean, that's obvious and Googleable, but nobody talks about this because, oh, that's just politics. So our just sort of, oh, that's just politicking over the Clintons, over Obama's Netflix deals, over the multi-generational nightmare that is the Bush family. And yes, over poor rinky-dink, Joe Biden machine politics Delaware crap. It's our nodding and smiling to that made Trump possible. So actually, I think investigating Hunter Biden and then using that as an ability to investigate the Trump family could actually be a great step forward in cleaning up the nightmare that is U.S. presidential politics.
Wow. Well, let's hope that happens, but sadly, I think it'll just be a lot of talking about a laptop for a year.
I think that's possible. But
were there any highlights from the laptop you enjoyed?
I haven't really dived into it, to be honest. Well, of course, the best highlight from this, it's just extraordinary. So this laptop that Hunter Biden, it seems, really was, he is literally a crackhead, just dropped off at a shady laptop fix-up place, and it happened to be a Trump supporter who sent it to Rudy Giuliani. The extraordinary thing about this, one of the emails found on the laptop was Hunter Biden, and this is the way a lot of corruption works in the United States today, was a media personality sending Hunter Biden an email asking for him to write an introduction, asking the vice president's son to write an introduction for this media personality's kid so it could get into Georgetown. I think that kid did get into Georgetown, and this media personality was Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson.
Of Fox fame.
Yes, the Fox News scourge of the Democratic Party and the evil leftists got his kid into Georgetown by writing a letter, by having Hunter Biden write a cover letter for him. It's just extraordinary how in bed with each other all these folks are. And you know what? A certain level I'm not somebody who's like, oh, sweep them all out. Like, we need politicians who are wheeler dealers. We need politicians who can figure out how to get things done. And it's never going to be beautiful. You know, there's always going to be earmarks. There's always going to be pork. There's always going to be corruption. But, you know, I'm not really willing to go to bat for this, 52-year-old drug addict to keep him, safe to preserve the feelings of the most powerful man on the planet. I think if investigating Hunter Biden can shine a light on all of this corruption, I think it's not a bad thing.
And if you have anything dodgy on your computer, just destroy it.
Yeah,
don't get it fixed.
Don't do that's the most incredible thing. This dude was doing sex tapes in his late 40s, man. Like, what? It's amazing.
So I think on that note, let's hope American politics gets a bit more transparent in the future.
Yes, sir. Let's do that.
Well, thank you, listeners, because without you, it would be nothing. And if you enjoyed that, you could go to YouTube and follow the More Freedom Foundation there for hundreds of other videos on a multitude of political topics. Thank you very much, and we'll hear from you next time. The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobO'Law, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod. But